genuinely may be one of the best Spider-Man stories I have ever read. Spider-Man Shadow of the Green Goblin is a miniseries written by legendary Spider-Man writer J.M. DeMatteis and spans over 4 issues. The basic premise of this book follows Peter Parker a few weeks after the death of Uncle Ben. Narrated by a present-day Peter Parker, it tells the story of how Peter fought, hunted, and interacted with the villain he would later go on to call the Proto-Goblin, aka Nels Van Adder. A lot of you won't recognise Nels Van Adder, but he actually first appeared in 1997 in Peter Parker Spider-Man Volume 1. Nels Van Adder was a former research assistant working in the early days of Oscorp. Van Adder was involved in some of the company's more secretive and ethically questionable experiments. Desperate to gain the approval of Norman Osborne, Van Adder agreed to become a test subject for an unstable serum that Osborne was developing. This serum was a precursor to the Goblin formula that would later to transform Norman Osborn into the Green Goblin that we all know and love. The serum had devastating effects on Van Adder. Instead of enhancing his physical and mental abilities in a controlled manner, it turned him into a monstrous creature, and as I mentioned, was later dubbed the Proto-Goblin. As the Proto-Goblin, Van Adder developed red skin, sharp claws, fangs, and a heightened physical strength. However, the transformation also drove him insane, leading to a violent and uncontrollable rage. This rage led to his wife and children exiling him, which leads us to the start of this story. Shadow of the Green Goblin follows Nels Van Adder as a character just as much as it does Peter Parker. All he wants to do is see his family again and become human. However, to become human, Adder needs a cure. He is eventually told that he can be cured by a woman that approaches him with one condition: to kidnap and bring Harry Osborn to her. It would be later revealed that this woman is actually none other than Emily Osborne, Harry's mother, who through a twisting turn of events faked her death due to her abusive relationship with Norman Osborn. Emily wants to be reunited with her son and promises Nels Van Adder a cure. That is, if he can actually successfully kidnap and bring Harry to her. In a tragic twist of events, Adder's continuing condition worsened until the serum that turned him into the Proto-Goblin eventually killed him, not allowing him to ever see his family ever again. This theme of family is carried throughout the entire series as a whole and even affects Peter as well. And that's why I think this book is so genius, because it manages to tie in Nels Van Adder's story, who is a very left field Spider-Man villain, with someone like Peter Parker. You'd also think that since this story takes place just after Uncle Ben's death and before any of the major stories written by Leon Ditko, that there wouldn't be much you could do with Peter's character. However, J.M. DeMatteis manages to write a story that perfectly intertwines the struggles he went through as Spider-Man during that period of time, with the story of Van Adder also intertwining through every single event that Peter was also feeling. Peter during this book is plagued by the idea that he was at fault for Uncle Ben's death. He didn't pull the trigger, but Peter was ultimately responsible for his uncle dying. Peter is rageful and bitter, and with these new powers, he doesn't hold back. He eventually ends up putting a criminal in hospital and instantly regrets it, showing his lack of responsibility. The rest of the book, Peter battles internally with himself to hold back against thugs and criminals. The internal struggle of Peter's mental state blows over into the relationship he has with Aunt May, as a brand new outlook is given as to how both of them reacted to Ben's death. May is distraught, and because Peter is out being Spider-Man, she resents him for a while. I thought this was really interesting. We have never really seen this side of May and Peter's relationship up until this point, especially this early on in the continuity. Both of them in the end talk out their bitterness and become content with Ben's death, and it's a really beautiful story. I've never read a Spider-Man book that manages to capture the rawness of Peter and Aunt May's relationship the way that Shadow of the Green Goblin does. Peter's story and Van Adder's story actually perfectly intertwine in this book, and let me explain. Both characters are grieving, and when they meet, unknowingly they take out their rage on each other. Obviously, Peter is grieving Uncle Ben, and Van Adder is grieving the fact that he may never be able to see his family again. This parallel of stories between hero and villain actually brings something interesting into question. When a hero and a villain fight in a comic book, like Spider-Man versus Van Adder for example, it's rare rarely ever brought into question the reason as to why both of them are fighting. Rather, a basic and firm ideological standpoint is built as the reason for the conflict. Van Adder is causing ruckus and he's kidnapping Harry Osborne, thus Peter intervenes as Spider-Man. It seems that simple, but when you go deeper, other moral and ethical implications start to come to the surface, and this book tackles this theme really well. This idea is expanded upon in issue 2 with a fantastic few panels where Peter and Flint Marko stop fighting just to talk. This may seem really bizarre for some Spider-Man fans. Peter never just sits and talks with his villains. Like, that's really weird. But JMD manages to execute this perfectly. For a moment, Flint and Peter stop fighting and speak about their feelings and why they are doing what they are doing. Peter actually finds out a lot about Flint Marko and why he does what he does. And in the end, he actually feels kind of bad for him and actually lets him go. It's sympathy in the ways that J.M. DeMatteis manages to explore with these characters that has rarely been ever explored in any other Spider-Man comic book. This is one of the many reasons as to why this series is great, and issue 2, which is my personal favourite of the whole series, is a grand example of this. The conversation between Flint Marko and Peter Parker ties really well into the story because of what we are meant to be feeling towards Van Adder, and how that connects with Peter's story overall. There are also a bunch of really cute side stories in this book as well. Even though Peter hadn't met them yet, Harry Osborne and Gwen Stacy also have big roles in this book too. We follow Gwen in a small B-plot where she's losing her mother, Helen Stacy. Gwen at first is sour about losing her mother, not being able to face her death. However, Gwen's mini arc in this series rounds out with her and her father, Captain Stacy, becoming content with her death, which, if you haven't noticed the parallels yet, perfectly intertwines itself with the theme of the book overall, and Peter's loss of Uncle Ben and Van Adder's loss of his family. I just think even the side characters have ties to the main story and the main theme. It's just genius. However, of course, if you have read the book, you'll notice I haven't touched on one major thing that happened in this series as of yet, which of course is Norman Osborn. Norman Osborn's role during this series is relatively small when it comes to in-person appearance, but his shadow quite literally is held over the entire story, like the title suggests. Every little detail is orchestrated by him or something that he has done. The little on-screen action we do get of Norman in this book is spent exploring his dark past and his closeted demons. Most of the book follows characters like Peter and Gwen who have to accept a loss or become content with something in their past. And the same does go for Norman, but in a very twisted sort of way. Norman's story still follows the theme of the book, but follows it a little differently. We sort of get the sense that not only is this book about the Proto-Goblin, which quite literally and physically is the shadow of the Green Goblin, but we also get this is the shadow of the Green Goblin because this is the turning point for Norman Osborn as a character. This is the turning point for Norman Osborn and the moment that I personally believe he became the Green Goblin and realized what he truly is. If it wasn't for this moment in this story, I don't think he becomes the Green Goblin later on 30 issues down the line in the Lee and Ditko books. It's hinted that Norman had demons all throughout his childhood. He tried to hide them away and would always take his anger and baggage out on his wife and son. It isn't until he comes face to face with Van Adder when he tells Adder to kill him. However, Adder can't. After all, Van Adder is not a murderer, even though he may look like one. And that's when Norman looks Adder straight in the eye and tells him, even though physically he is the monster, the real goblin is Norman Osborn himself. Fully realizing and becoming content with the person under the mask of Norman Osborn, his true self, the Green Goblin. I just think, but it's genius, right? It's great. Not to mention, there are so many moments in this where if one little thing went differently, or if Peter had investigated something maybe a little bit further, that maybe Norman wouldn't have ever become the Goblin in the first place, and maybe Gwen wouldn't have ever died. And it really makes you think the turn of events that had to occur for Norman to become the Goblin, for Gwen to die, for everything to happen with Harry Osborn and Van Adder, it's just absolutely crazy. Unlike quite a lot of miniseries nowadays, this backstory isn't just a pointless precursor to future stories. It actually adds way more depth to the likes of Gwen, Norman, Harry, and even Peter himself. After seeing what Peter goes through here and the way he reacts to Ben's death, sheds a brand new light on the Lee and Ditko stories, and if anything makes makes them 10 times better. Overall, I think Spider-Man Shadow of the Green Goblin is really worth your time, and if by the end of this video you haven't been convinced to read it, then go read it. Please, just go read it. It is absolutely awesome, and definitely my favourite comic book that I have read this year. Yes, even more than Ultimate Spider-Man. That's how much I love this. Speaking of Ultimate Spider-Man though, if you want to see my review of the latest issue, make sure to go and click right here. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a member and click the join button down below for as little as 99 pence a month. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care and peace.